Today to have a guest with us. This is Jonathan Shea, who's written one of the more important books on Vietnam in the past decade or so, Achilles in Vietnam. He's so I get this right, a clinical psychiatrist and a neuropathologist. Does that sound good? Close enough? Okay. Jonathan Shea, we'll let him take over and tell us about himself.
Hi, I am a psychiatrist. All of my patients for the last 12 years have been Vietnam combat veterans with severe psychological injuries. And basically, these veterans have taken my life and totally redirected it. It's been a tremendous plus for me, a tremendous enrichment of the quality of my life working for the veterans, which is how I see it. Let me, since this is a Vietnam course, let me talk a bit about what I think made a big difference in the Vietnam situation that injured people. Now, first of all, war always injures people. The only way to totally end that fact is to end the practice of war, which we can do, but that's another story. In Vietnam, we did certain things very, very badly. Number one, we trained people with one group of soldiers or Marines or sailors or airmen, and then sent them over with complete strangers to join units which were basically paper fictions. Units, except at the very beginning and the very end, units did not go in or come out as a unit, but were put in and kept in the war zone for the whole period, with people trickling in and trickling out under a system of individual rotation, so that people in general went to Vietnam with complete strangers on an airplane, with complete strangers, were sent to a replacement depot, and then were dealt out like cards to to units that had requisitioned a certain MOS. And then at the end of a 12 or 13-month tour of duty, 13 months for the Marines, 12 for basically everybody else, I believe. I couldn't tell you about the Navy or Air Force, but anyway, Army 12 months, Marine 13 months. They'd come home on a plane load of strangers and come home very, very quickly, usually to an immediate leave, or in some instances to immediate discharge to civilian life, especially during the last years of the war when they were reducing the size of the force. So that's one thing that we did very, very badly. People, at the very least, were left with a profound worry, and which then turned into guilt at what happened to the people that they left behind. So if nothing else, this was a source of injury, that the bonds that had formed between people who were fighting together during that period that they were there were ripped out of that and left knowing that other people were still in danger. So we did that badly. I should mention that from a purely military point of view, a trickle-in, trickle-out individual replacement unit is never going to perform as well militarily as a unit that trains together, goes into danger together, and eventually comes out together. But while they're there and fighting, it's a fundamental observation of military historians and military social scientists that cohesive units, for which stability is the most important feature, that cohesive units are far more effective militarily. They know each other's jobs, they cover each other's backs, they are just very much more effective. Okay, so that's number one that we did very badly. Number two has to do with the officer career system. The officer career system then, as now, had the concept that every officer is supposed to be a generalist, which is to say, to have a wide range of experiences to give them a taste of lots of different jobs that an officer does, and to be promotable then and now. You had to have all of the right boxes checked. Well, one crucial box to get checked was, did you have troop command? It's usually stated as, did you have combat command? But in fact, the promotion system, to my knowledge, did not require that you be shot at, but you had to have troop command. And in the name of quote-unquote equity, where you have this vast numbers of officers at the level of captain looking to be promoted to major, at the level of major looking to be promoted to lieutenant commander, lieutenant colonel, you had to get that box checked of either being a company commander or a battalion operations officer or battalion commander. You had to have this kind of... So what, in order to spread this benefit around, to make it equitable, fair, the word fair was constantly used, in order to make it fair to all the officers, and there were so many of them. At that time, we were almost fully officered for a 10 million man army. The officer system had been designed by General Marshall after World War II to support a very rapid mass mobilization into a World War II sized army to fight the Russians on the ground in Europe. And that mobilization model, incidentally, is still built into our personnel system. So there was this vast number of officers who wanted to get their tickets punched or get all the boxes checked. And so what that resulted in was that above the level of platoon leader, the platoon leaders did, the lieutenants, the platoon leaders did serve 1 year with the troops that they led, mostly. But above the level of platoon leader, the captains and the field grade officers, the battalion officers, they were 6 months in troop leadership. And that is not enough time to learn the job. It's not enough time to learn the terrain. It's not enough time to learn the weather. It's not enough time to learn the habits of the enemy, the capabilities of the enemy in terms of weapons and tactics. It's not enough time to find out who can be trusted, who has their head screwed on right in your own people. If somebody says, there's a problem over there, how do you learn who can be relied on, that you listen immediately when this guy says there's a problem over there, because there is a problem over there. So we had institutionalized mediocrity, or worse, sometimes incompetence in our troop leaders in Vietnam because of this. It's true they spent a year in Vietnam, but 6 months of it was in troop leadership and 6 months of it was in a staff assignment. Very often in a different unit than the person had served as a troop leader. So we had incompetent leadership at those levels. I'm not even going to talk about the competence of the higher leadership, which is nothing to boast about, but I'm talking about the sort of where the rubber meets the road, not deciding big issues like, well, do we go into Cambodia or don't we go into Cambodia? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where the fights were happening. Then the third thing is that our training in Vietnam was, well, I don't want to overgeneralize. In general, those veterans that I've worked with who were Marines, in general, they say, yes, I was well trained for what I had to face. And equally frequently, Army veterans say, no way did I know what I had to face. They did not prepare us either psychologically or functionally for what we actually had to do. So these three things, cohesion, or the systematic destruction of cohesion by this individual rotation system, cohesion, leadership, and training were all somewhere between poor and catastrophic. These are the three things that I have learned protect the soul and the mind of someone who is fighting a war. They are also, each one of these is also a combat strength multiplier, and if you've got them, you're going to have fewer casualties physically and psychiatrically simply because you're performing well in this terrible situation. There's an old one-liner that says there's no substitute for victory. Well, this applies in terms of limiting casualties at both psychiatric and physical at the small unit level. There's no substitute for being good at what you're being asked to do. And cohesion, leadership, and training are the keys to being good at fighting. And we were not good at fighting. Just to give you a picture, in Vietnam we were up against what General Moore, the author of the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, General Moore described the Vietnamese enemy that we were fighting as the finest light infantry in the world. Now, that is a big-time description of being up against not only a worthy adversary, but a very competent and very dangerous adversary. The typical North Vietnamese officer of a typical battalion commander in the North Vietnamese Army would serve for years, sometimes 6 years, in the same area of operations, that we were sending in a new guy every 6 months. There were painful examples, unfortunately not just one or two, but numerous, of units being ambushed in the same spot in the same way, repeatedly because there was no learning curve. Colonel so-and-so was rotated out and replaced by Colonel so-and-so, and the new guy had no ideas. Oh, well, let's go over there. And that kind of thing just simply didn't happen to the Vietnamese because their opposite number was in the same spot for years. So I hope somebody will, I don't know, click a cricket or something if I start to really get on my soapbox. I know I'm on it to some degree, but you talk about fairness to the officer. Well, where's the fairness to the enlisted men who are dying because the officers are getting a fair and equal chance at promotion? Who gives a... Never mind. The point is that we didn't do this well, and so we have a lot of casualties, physical and psychiatric. I talk at a lot of universities, and I'm quite impressed with the fact that there is one fact in the administrative area, and really what I'm talking about here, it has to do with the administrative and policy side of military forces, which generally people glaze over. It's sort of boring and complicated and so forth. The one thing people know about the Vietnam War at the administrative level is the matter of the individual rotations. They know about the 12-month tours. They know about DEROS. They know that people went over with strangers and came back with strangers. And they're horrified to learn that we're still doing that. They're horrified that we still don't keep people together. And I'm just fascinated. This is the one thing, at the administrative level, this is the one thing that everybody knows about the Vietnam War. I don't think they know any other. They know this, they know that, they know the other. But at the administrative level, they know this one thing. And I'm enormously heartened by that, because when I talk at universities, people say, "What? We're still doing that? That was a disaster. How could we still be doing it?" And so the fire in my belly, as I think you can tell without any difficulty, is for prevention, to prevent these terrible psychological and characterological injuries that the veterans I work with carry. So I'm heartened by the fact that there's a broad public understanding that the leading preventive psychiatry move that we can make is to keep people together. Train them together, send them into danger together, and bring them home together. How about if I stop ranting for a few minutes and give people a chance to make comments, ask questions, throw tomatoes?
I won't do that. To support some of the fire in your belly, I'm a veteran. You talked about ticket punching. There was another aspect that you may have seen in some of your counseling, and that is the idea of medals being awarded at the, I'd say at the field grade level, by staff officers who weren't really in combat that much, but were flown into combat situations in order to get the CIB, get the Combat Infantry Badge. And there's a tremendous lack of morale, you might say, among the troops that saw that happen, because they were flown in safe situations, removed from the theater, gone back, and they got the same Bronze Star that somebody got that was there throughout this entire incursion. And I think the interesting thing to me is that most of those were officers who maybe had one combat experience, and yet those are the combat veterans today who you probably don't see a lot of, is my guess. Have you seen that with other, have you heard of that?
I've certainly heard of it. I've heard a great deal of bitterness over the corruption of decorations in every different aspect. I mean, the different ways that it became corrupted were so varied and so numerous that I mean, if I had sat down to figure out how to corrupt, I would never have come up with all the ways that it became corrupted. And that creates enormous bitterness, because people feel that their own honor has been diminished and smeared with shit, really, when that happens. In Homer's Iliad, which my book, Achilles in Vietnam, really is about the story that Homer tells of Achilles. The story Homer tells is that Achilles was on the verge of fragging his commander, Agamemnon. He pulls his sword out, and then the goddess Athena comes and jerks his head around by pulling his hair and says, "You know, don't you do that." And he puts his sword back, and he doesn't frag Agamemnon. He tongue lashes him, but what that was all about was about a decoration that it was a geros, a prize of honor. It happened not to be a ribbon. It was a physical prize, which is to say a captive woman. But that's not what was going on between Achilles and Agamemnon. Wasn't a fight between two soldiers over a woman. It was a fight over honor, and Achilles felt dishonored by Agamemnon trying to take his prize of honor. That it was the equivalent in modern terms of a modern colonel who has a sergeant in his battalion who's received the Medal of Honor and is wearing the ribbon on his tunic, and the colonel says, "Oh, I don't have that," and just takes it off his tunic. Agamemnon was no more justified in taking Achilles' geros than this modern colonel would have been in taking that Medal of Honor ribbon. So these are profound things. To talk of idealism is hard because this word has become so debased in the mouths of orators and politicians. But the fact is that there are people literally with their lives at risk. And they're not, it's not like they're risking their lives so they can become rich as Rockefeller the next day if everything comes out. And okay, I'm going to gamble it all on one throw of the dice, and if I get through this alive, I'll be rich for life. What's the reward? The reward is protecting one's fellows. The reward is the idealism of doing one's share for the nation, however one understands that. These are non-material rewards that, and anything that debases those rewards is like a knife in the gut. Yes?
I was thinking in your 12 years, I had a couple of questions, but one at a time. In your 12 years of working with Vietnam veterans, how do the Vietnam veterans that you've worked with, how do they perceive the Vietnam people? How do they perceive the Viet Minh? How do they perceive Ho Chi Minh? How do they perceive that whole struggle that was going on that we got involved in Vietnam?
There are many different answers to that almost as many different answers as veterans that I've worked with. And I won't try and imagine statistics that 32% think this and 15% think that. And I'll just give an example. One man who was a Marine, who is a Marine veteran, grew up in South Boston, had a Roman Catholic parochial education, and in his account of things was taught in this Roman Catholic upbringing to be respectful of other religions and to treat other religions with dignity and the understanding that the sacred showed up everywhere in the world. Well, his unit was, his company was assigned to do security at one point in the following setting. They were taken into the jungle near Da Nang and were told to provide security for a group of Vietnamese who were tearing down a Buddhist temple. And he said, he looked at this temple and he said, this is old. This is like we see in National Geographic. This is a sacred place. And what are these? And he, in the course of this event, he discovered that these were Vietnamese Catholics who were tearing down this Buddhist temple. And he's saying, why are they doing this? This is a holy place. We're fighting for these people. We're fighting for these people who are destroying this Buddhist temple. Why are we doing this? So that's one example. He saw the Vietnamese as being very much human, fully human like himself. There are others who persist in seeing Vietnamese in very stereotyped racist terms, who refer to them as gooks or dinks or slants. And it doesn't happen as much as it used to, but part of that is that in our treatment program we vigorously discourage that, because whatever the ethics of that are, we regard it as harming the veteran himself to engage in that kind of thinking. There are those who distinguish between the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, and the ARVNs. In general, where the same veteran will speak about all three groups, in general, the rankings are similar. That they despised the ARVNs, that they admired the North Vietnamese as a very dangerous and worthy adversary, and then the Viet Cong were somewhere in between, either closer to the ARVNs that they just hit and ran, whereas the North Vietnamese would stand and fight, or closer to the North Vietnamese that they were also a very competent and respect-worthy enemy. One veteran became very much involved in helping with a Vietnamese orphanage, and was terribly shattered when the orphans and the nuns taking care of them were killed, apparently by the Viet Cong. There was ugliness enough to go around on all sides. I mean, nobody comes out of any war, and certainly not this one with clean hands. But there's a whole range of responses.
See if I'm doing this right, since I used to have a mic on. This has to do with the relationship within the American mission in Vietnam. Very few American soldiers actually saw combat. It's about 10%, I think.
Let me just, when I speak of combat veterans, I basically use the operating definition that was developed by the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, which had to do not so much with MOS as with the actual experience of contact with the enemy. Sometimes people who didn't have combat MOS were up to their necks, and sometimes people who did have combat MOS never heard a shot fired in anger or fired a weapon. Now, using their operating definition, there, first of all, were 3.1 million people who served in Vietnam or in the waters around it or in the air around it. Of those, roughly 750,000 meet the criteria for high combat exposure. So my mental arithmetic isn't real swift, but yeah. Now, if you make your cut points differently, if you insist on only looking at formations like the 173rd Airborne that were just moved from one fight to another, to another, to another, and say that that is truly a combat formation, then there are very few. The tooth-to-tail ratio there is extreme. Now, so that's what I use as the
among vets that you've talked to. Do you find that they're almost exclusively men who actually saw combat? And if so, is there a resentment among them with the REMFs? Yeah.
The men that I work with are exclusively combat veterans. That's not to say that nobody but them was injured, but I'm the psychiatrist for a very small program, and the enormous good fortune that I've had is being able to work with the same men over a long period, so that I get to really know them and often know their families and their friends and so forth. And this is I regard it as a privilege. The present complexion of medicine in the United States works so much against that, it's sort of assembly line. Oh, you have PTSD, you get 15 sessions of treatment. And obviously you don't get to know people well in that time.
The statistics on soldiers who've had PTSD, on suicides, alcoholism, drug abuse, would indicate that this is fairly widespread, and it would seem, statistically at least, would encompass vets no matter what they did in Vietnam. I mean, is that a kind of an accurate reading of it?
Let me try and run through the drill on what the evidence is from the NVVRS, the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. This is an epidemiological study done on the mandate of Congress in the mid-'80s. It was very well-designed, well-funded, and well-executed. There are many people who regard it as the gold standard for epidemiological studies in psychiatry because it is what's known as a population study rather than a clinic study. That is, that the people who got into the NVVRS as subjects for interview and so forth were selected at random from the total population of that 3.1 million whoever served. Plus, they picked a random sample of demographically matched civilians who never served. So they had a control group. The basic drill is that of those, if you look at the 3.1 million, that the population estimate is that some 17% of that 3.1 million at the time of the study in the mid-'80s still met all the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So if you're good at mental arithmetic, which I'm not, you come up with a figure of, it's something 17% of 3.1 million. Somebody do it.
It's a little under 600,000.
Okay, I was going to say about 500,000 or 600,000. About 500,000 or 600,000 of that out of that whole 3.1 million. Now, if you only look at the 750,000, or the sample that represents it, the 750,000 who had high combat exposure, it's like 35% or 37% of them who, at the time of the study in the mid-'80s, met all the criteria for PTSD. So you're talking there about 250,000. So of the people in the country who served in Vietnam, roughly half of them who in the mid-'80s, nobody knows where they are today, but in the mid-'80s met the full criteria for PTSD. Roughly half of those were combat vets, and roughly half of those were not. And if I recall correctly, the rate for the matched civilian controls was something like 3.5%. I don't remember that number, but it was somewhere it was reasonably low. And the percentage was some large multiple of what was in the civilian controls.
Again, since this is a study that was done with Vietnam recently, it's difficult to find numbers, but how do you think this would compare to veterans of World War II or Korea? I mean, is Vietnam that much of an aberration?
First of all, if you ask me what the data show, I have to say there are no data of comparable quality. Vietnam is the only war for which we have these kind of data collected in this way and done with as much care and faithfulness as this study was done. Now, if you ask me what I believe is that, first of all, in World War II, there were a vast number of combat trauma cases, and they were stuck away in these huge neuropsych hospitals that sprang up near every city. 3,000 to 5,000 bed neuropsych hospitals, and that's an unwritten history of World War II. We don't really know much about what went on in those hospitals, who the patients were, and what their subsequent fate was. What I believe is that for comparable intensity of combat exposure, that the rate of injury, of long-lasting injury, was probably less in World War II, but not for the reason that people think, not because the World War II generation had the right stuff or anything of the sort, but for the administrative thing, that the typical pattern in World War II was to go over together, to fight together, and then to come back not necessarily compactly together, but to come back slowly by ship, often, usually with a dozen or several score people that you had served with, so that the horrible situation of going over with strangers and coming back with strangers very quickly. People have described it to me as like being dropped in from Mars to be from a firefight to the streets of Chelsea or South Boston or Somerville in 50 hours. I mean, people really were disoriented, and their emotions and self-control were just bubbling and seething. So the World War II veterans, in World War II, only the generals moved by air. Everybody else moved by ship. Yes?
It's easy to understand why the second of your 3 points continued. Someone benefited from this system of the officer career system, the officers or whatever. But why did they continue? I mean, why didn't anyone recognize the problems of this rotation system? Or was it just, what was the reason why it continued throughout the whole process and still continues, as you mentioned?
Well, I have to ask guidance as to how much time I can take answering this question. My present activities are 1/4 time in the clinic and 3/4 time writing and agitating for reform of these very things in the armed forces. So I know quite a lot about it. In the 1980s, while General Shai Meyer was the Army Chief of Staff, Meyer, incidentally, was the first Army Chief of Staff that had not come out of World War II. He was a combat leader in Vietnam, and all of the senior officers around him were Vietnam junior combat officers in Vietnam. He instituted a program known as Cohort. Cohesion Operational Readiness Training is that, you know how the Army loves acronyms. But anyway, what Cohort did was to form up companies the first day of basic training and to keep them together through the whole 3-year term of their first enlistment. Well, Cohort, from a military point of view, was a dazzling success. I know well the people at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research that did the field evaluations of Cohort. I know the people at the Army Research Institute for Behavioral and Social Sciences that did other social science on Cohort. It was an enormous success, except that the personnel bureaucracy hated it because they had to do it all by hand. They didn't have the computer systems to manage units. They only had computer systems to manage individuals. The officer corps hated it because the officer career paths and the ways that officer performance was assessed was not harmonized with these stabilized units. Now, to give you an idea of how painfully slight sometimes can be the reasons when a beneficial thing that makes a beneficial thing go down the tubes. If you have a battalion with 3 cohort companies on a 3-year cycle, one of those 3 companies is always in the training up year, which means that two of those companies are rated as ready, and one of them is rated as unready, which means that the officer who's the CO of that battalion has statistics that look worse than the officer who's the CO of a traditional trickle-in, trickle-out individual replacement battalion, because there he has 3 companies, all of which are rated as ready. They may be mediocre, but they're ready. Now, what Walter Reed Army Institute of Research discovered was that these cohort companies just blew everybody away with their military capabilities, because instead of learning the first year and then repeating first grade the second year and then repeating first grade again the third year, the way most trickle in, trickle out Army units work, they graduated from first to second grade and second to third grade, and they developed these higher level, elite level unit skills where they could read each other's minds, where they knew each other's jobs, and they pushed their officers and their NCOs, give us more interesting and difficult challenges. They were all of the mythology about enlisted men needing to be lashed and prodded forward were just out the window. They were driving their officers forward to give them ever more challenging and interesting and demanding training exercises, because they were just constantly getting better. Furthermore, they developed spontaneous models of cooperative learning. They knew that they were going to war together. If anything happened, they were going to war together. So everybody in this unit has to know how to do things. It wasn't a matter of, well, in another 3 months, I'm never going to see these jerks again. They knew they were all in it together, and they brought along the slower members of the unit. So the answer is that yes, especially the generation that served in Vietnam saw this as something that needed to be corrected. And Shai Meyer, Don Starry, who was the TRADOC commander in the 80s, Bob Elton, who was the PERSCOM, the head of Army personnel in the 80s, all wanted this to happen. And it happened briefly, and it's now all gone. And it's all gone for reasons related to the mindset of the military bureaucrats. And I spend most of my time trying to reinstitute stable units. The Marine Corps currently does a small version of this. That is, they keep fire teams together. That's the lowest Marine echelon, the four-man fire team. They assemble them the first day of boot camp, and they stay together through their whole first term of enlistment. The current Commandant, General Jones, wants to increase the echelon of that, and we'll see how that develops. But the Army is totally uninterested in reintroducing unit stability. Yeah.
I've always believed that that my reasonably successful adjustment was because I was 25 years old, married, and a son born right before I went over. I believe the average age of combat veterans in Vietnam was about 19. Do your studies indicate that the older combat veterans adjusted better than the younger ones?
I believe the NVVRS shows that. I couldn't quote the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that when they ran the data by age, that it showed that. And the forces in World War II, the average age was something like 26, which would be another reason, again, reflecting administrative phenomena, not the human material that went into World War II and into Vietnam. But that would be another reason that I would believe, again, I say believe because the data aren't there, that the rates of injury, of enduring injury, were lower. Yeah.
Always running my mouth. I guess from looking at there were were interesting terminology that you use that I simply had not thought of before, but I find that it's descriptive, and where you speak of psychological injury and you speak of characterological injury and psychiatric casualties and all of that. And I was not a veteran, but had the opportunity to have veterans work for me as a contractor and as a contractor on the VA hospital back in the 80s during the renovations and stuff. And from guys who would go out on point, as was explained to me, and had to disassociate themselves from other human beings because of all of what they saw, and just stayed out there doing their job but not making human contact, and then came back to this society. And having to deal with, again, these are my perceptions from what they told me, deal with psychiatrists and sociologists who really didn't understand the experience, had no point of reference for helping these men to heal. And so I guess a couple of questions really about your practice and about your involvement, what has drawn you into this practice that you've undertaken, and if in fact what I just mentioned in terms of just really the ineptitude of the psychiatric community, and particularly that VA psychiatric staff, of being able to handle the needs and deliver the services that the men who came back, stressed the needs that they had. Did I ask a question?
That's
Okay.
a very rich and complex question. I realize that I'm so obsessed with this issue of prevention. I realize that I didn't go through some of the basic facts, at least as I package them, on psychological injury. First of all, let me start by saying I may be the only person that you'll talk to who uses this turn of phrase, psychological injury. I find it very objectionable that the official terminology is post-traumatic stress disorder. It sounds like a sickness. If you have somebody with a broken leg, you don't say he's sick with a broken leg sickness. You say he's been injured. Well, PTSD is a war injury. It's a war injury that's simple. There's nothing weird or mysterious to put it that way, and it's the truth as I see it. So having said that PTSD is a war injury, I then want to divide it into two categories: simple PTSD and complex PTSD. Simple PTSD is, in my understanding, is the persistence into civilian life of valid combat survival skills and adaptations. That the body and the mind, when faced with mortal danger, mobilizes itself in certain ways, focuses and channels itself in certain ways to survive. And these are valid for that life-threatening situation, especially the situation where someone is literally out there trying to kill you. In war, that's real. The enemy really is out to kill you. Now, when you return to civilian life and these very valid adaptations persist, they produce, in my version of these facts, they appear as simple PTSD. The hyperarousal of the body, the mobilization of the mind and body for constant danger, but also the numbing, the shutting down. You encountered this and recognized it as a very scary and debilitating phenomenon. to shut down all those emotions that do not contribute to survival in this fatal situation is a valid adaptation to it. And you bring that back to civilian life, it makes it very hard to have a life in a family when your emotions, except for anger, are just gone. Very hard to negotiate relationships with coworkers, with an employer, because we depend on emotion. Emotions carry an enormous amount of cognitive information in interpersonal relationships. We depend on emotion to negotiate these relationships and negotiate them successfully and without an enormous investment of effort. So simple PTSD is simply the persistence of what were valid adaptations to combat into civilian life. Now, I believe that just like with any other war injury, that people have quite a remarkable ability to get past and overcome these injuries. I mean, you meet people who are missing limbs and who have nonetheless managed to have a flourishing human life. They still have specific disabilities. For instance, to be together in a crowd is very hard for an infantry soldier because bunching up was inviting a mortar attack or a burst of machine gun fire. It was making yourself a target. There are a lot of combat veterans who may never be able to be comfortable in a compact crowd of people. Now, this is a specific disability, but it doesn't necessarily prevent that veteran from having a flourishing life in his family and his community. If the injuries are severe enough, just like somebody who has all 4 limbs shot off, if the injury is severe enough, of course the person's ability to have a flourishing life can be severely impaired. But where having a good human life becomes impossible is when the injury invades character. I have argued in my book that in the military situation, this happens when there has been a betrayal of what's right by people who hold power in this military situation. And someone returning to civilian life with simple PTSD, everybody who has complex PTSD has simple PTSD to begin with, but then added to it is the character damage. And what this character damage looks like is a destruction of the capacity for social trust. In the civilian situation, social trust is the ability to trust someone on the basis of their credentials and their position in an organization. Whether it's a work organization, a hospital organization, a governmental organization. Well, the veterans that I work with have their capacity for social trust has been devastated. Now, what is left behind when the capacity for social trust is destroyed is not nothing. It's not a vacuum. What's left behind is the active expectancy of exploitation and harm. That other people are out to either use you for their own ends or to injure you. Now, if you want to call that paranoid, go ahead, be my guest. I don't believe we learn anything new or there's no predictive value in hanging that label on it. I think it's a kind of pseudo-knowledge to call that paranoia. But it will fit various definitions of paranoia. That's okay with me, but I prefer the experiential language to expect exploitation and harm. And so when the capacity for social trust has been destroyed, the capacity for a good human life is also virtually gone. And our program is aimed first and foremost at rebuilding the capacity for social trust. We also do aim at the symptoms of simple PTSD. Some of those are clearly based on irreversible brain changes and may be improved by certain specific medications. But this work is so full of paradox for American psychiatry, because American psychiatry believes that character never changes, that you cannot, if somebody has bad character, forget it. Nothing's going to change. Well, we see in our program that people's character can recover, that recovery is definitely possible. I've seen it with my own eyes. This, to my mind, this is not an issue. It is possible. American psychiatry tends to believe that irreversible brain changes due to experience, while it may happen in theory, in that in the most extreme sort of material version of the mind, if I say to you, remember the number sequence 212, that I have physically changed your brain, and if you remember the number sequence 212, it's evidence that your brain physical changes have happened. They'll accept that kind of physicalist notion, but if you say, well, what psychiatric disorders are caused by experience, they'll say none. That's the typical modern American psychiatry. Well, probably severe PTSD causes irreversible changes in brain function and even in brain structure. Doug Bremner at Yale was the first to do NMR studies of the volume of the part of the brain that's responsible for emotion and for memory and the connection of memory to emotion, the part called the hippocampus. And in combat vets with PTSD, this was shrunken compared to combat vets with no PTSD, and he was careful to match with regard to lifetime alcohol consumption, because that can also shrink the hippocampus. There are changes in the way the adrenal gland is controlled by the pituitary, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. And these changes are very well documented. There are changes in the startle reflex, something you can't fake. I was in Jerusalem at the lab of Arik Shalev, who's the chairman of the psychiatry department at Hadassah Medical School and a reserve lieutenant colonel in the Israel Defense Forces. And he did a lot of this work along with Roger Pittman at Harvard Medical School on the startle reflex. And I asked Arik to put me in the apparatus, which is headphones. He didn't wire me for the electrodes on the muscles and stuff. But I wanted to hear the stimulus that gave rise to the startle reflex that they measure. And so I put these on, and after 10 or 15 seconds of silence, a tone came on that was no louder than a busy signal on the telephone. And I jumped when it first came on. The silence, I'd gotten used to silence, and it came on. And then after a random period, it came on a second time, and I sort of felt a little flicker in my body. Then the third time it came on, nothing. And by the fifth time the tone came on, my mind was elsewhere. I was hardly even hearing it. Now that phenomenon, the declining response to this sudden auditory stimulus, is known as habituation. That's the physiology jargon for this phenomenon. Well, combat veterans with PTSD, in some large proportion of them, simply do not habituate to acoustic startle. And Shalev showed me the records. They measure electrical currents from these muscles in the forehead and other things to document physiologically the startle reaction. And some of these men, the 15th time the stimulus was presented, was just as high a startle. And you cannot fake this in that the latency between the onset of the tone and the onset of the muscular response is too short to do consciously. If you will yourself to do it, it has whatever, a 600 millisecond latency. If it's a genuine startle, it's like a 300 millisecond latency. This is a brain change. So there are others. It would get tedious for me to run through all the other evidences of physical changes in the brain in response to severe trauma. Most of these, I would hesitate to say this one, and this one, because my memory isn't that good. But most of these have been replicated in other trauma survivor populations, political torture survivors or different or combat survivors in different parts of the world. So these things begin to look and smell like scientific facts, which is to say that they're repeatable in different laboratories than they were first done and in different populations than they were first done. So I believe that simple PTSD represents to a significant degree a reflection of brain changes that may be improved or modified by drug treatment, but are probably not curable by any of these drugs. That just that the physiological, just in the same way that giving insulin doesn't cure diabetes, it can control the symptoms of it. Now, I am a little bit uneasy about talking about the VA on the television, given that I am a VA employee. I can say that talking about...
Shall I restate my question?
Well, let me babble for a few minutes. Talking about the VA may never have been a sensible way to talk, because there is vast range among medical centers in the quality and variety of services in any particular area. And when a veteran asks me about getting treatment for PTSD in the VA, my response is invariably inquire locally. Only local information matters. Ask other veterans who's trustworthy. Where are there good programs in your area? So that within a given medical center, there may be some outstanding programs that are right next to some that are not outstanding. There, within given programs, there can be some outstanding clinicians right next to clinicians who are not outstanding. Inquire locally, the only reliable source of information. I mean, maybe nobody's information on this is reliable, but the best of all the bad information comes from other veterans. You won't find out necessarily from asking doctors or social workers. I mean, they may or may not hit it, but the only really valid source of information as other veterans. Yeah.
I realize that we're running low on time, so this is a question I think you could probably answer pretty quickly. Do you know, is anyone doing similar work to what you're doing among ARVN veterans in the Vietnamese refugee community in the United States, or for that matter in Vietnam itself?
The simple answer to that question is I don't know. I know that there's something going on in Vietnam. I have not followed it. In the Vietnamese population in the United States, I just simply don't know. I know of a program for Cambodian refugees and survivors of the Cambodian terrors, but that's different than what you're asking about. I just don't know. Yes?
The word that jumps out to me that you've used, and I think you've tied it, I'd ask you to confirm this, you've tied it to the complex variety of PTSD, okay, is betrayal. Now, am I right in hearing, first of all, am I right in hearing that that sense of betrayal at a fundamental trust level is and defines the entrance of a injured person into the complex variety? And then second, is there anything you can add to this sense? Because we as a nation, to a large extent, feel betrayed by what went on with the whole program, the Vietnam program.
For betrayal to itself be a pathogenic factor to actually cause injury, for betrayal to do that, basically the stakes in the situation have to be really serious. I mean, if somebody is playing penny-ante poker and discovers that the person they're playing with is pulling aces out of their sleeves, they're going to feel betrayed, but we don't expect this to lead to serious psychiatric disturbance, to serious dysfunction and somebody's life being wrecked. And if that happens, I think we sort of suspect that something else was going on. But the basic thing about war is that it often produces situations that are so hideous that anybody will be injured who is in there because the stakes are so high. And so I basically agree with your formulation, that, but with the qualification that any high-stakes betrayal of what's right, and the high stakes are critical there, can lead to damage to character. That's my belief. I don't have a whole panoply of research data to support that, but that's what I believe is true.
And to add a little anecdote to that, I was once giving a talk based on my work, which argues that the military leadership, Wheeler, Westmoreland, from the top down, understood that the situation wasn't going well and maintained the war nonetheless. And there was the chair of the panel was also a Vietnam vet. And after I got done speaking, I mean, he was red with anger, and he said, if I'd known this, I would have fragged that son of a bitch. And I mean, it just kind of came to him all of a sudden. So
people die.
Yeah, that was his point. That was his point. They were playing politics for institutional reasons, for political reasons, while my buddies were getting shot at and killed. Yeah. One more, somebody?
Okay, I want to take 1 minute out of the 3 remaining minutes to go back to prevention. Primary prevention, and I'm talking now in pure public health terms, primary prevention is to remove the injurious agent, which is to say to end the social practice of war. We can do this. We are the only remaining superpower, and we're pissing away our opportunity to take world leadership on ending war. I'm not talking about ending evil. I'm not talking about ending violence. I'm not talking about the United States being the policeman for the world. But the United States has to take the world in supporting the police. We can end war by trustworthy collective security. This is an old answer. It's boring. It's hard work. It will take generations or centuries to do it, but like the ending of slavery, it's something that we can do. There's an old one-liner from the Talmud that says, "You are not expected to finish the job, but neither are you free to lay it down." That's the way I feel about ending war, that we can do this, and it's jolly well time that we get started.
Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it, and thank you all for asking good questions and taking part in this. And we'll see you for class next week.